Jocelyn.
And I'm Danny.
And this is Why Can't We Talk About It? So, today we are recording our inaugural episode. We decided to start this podcast after Danny and I spent many hours on the phone talking about our individual mental health journeys, and we thought that it might be fun to start recording them and sharing them because we were leaving those calls both with the sense of, wow, somebody else understands what I'm going through. And isn't that all what we want at the end of the day? Just to feel seen and understood. So that's why we started this podcast. And Danny came up with the very excellent name because a lot of the topics that we cover are not controversial, so to speak, but they are things that, you may not necessarily bring up on the regs with your family and your friends. So maybe you can have us in your ears covering topics that you wish you could talk more about. And after hearing and understanding, you might open up to your own loved ones as well.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good way to describe things. And I have to say, it's actually kind of cool that we're actually doing this. It's actually been a long time coming already, I want to say. And I feel like for us, it's been just actually a learning process in terms of just how exactly does a podcast even work. That's definitely something that I think we're going to go into a little bit more. But definitely one thing that I would say is, why did we start this? And we'll obviously go into this even more. But, for me personally here was the fact that, I kind of just wished, for me going through a lot of these things on my own, as somebody who listens to podcasts, I like to watch these videos of people having these conversations. And I always thought, it'd be kind of cool if somebody just was talking about the things that resonates with me, because if they did, it would probably make me understand that there are people out there going through the same thing instead of the opposite, which was sometimes I felt like I was fairly alone in the things that I had to deal with. And that definitely wasn't very helpful. But, with Jocelyn and myself, to have the conversations that we're having, it actually opened up the idea to me that Jocelyn also deals with things, even though on the exterior, she might not give that off. But sometimes you have to kind of get to know somebody a little bit more on a deeper level to get to that point. And it was from that where I thought, even actually as an offhand comment in one of our conversations, I thought, hey, wouldn't it be kind of cool if there was a podcast like this? And honestly, Jocelyn, I thought you were going to laugh, but you did not, which also threw me off. And I remember you kind of just being like, hey, Danny, if you're being serious, I'm on board.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. We'll co-host. And I was like, that's hilarious. Let me sleep on that. And I remember after a call, I was like, this actually sounds pretty interesting. And it would be a great creative outlet. And the fact that, even though we both, have work and whatnot, but to be able to do something like this, I thought would be pretty cool. And so that's kind of how it started. And here we are recording our first one.
Yes. And we are going to cover lots of different things. We're going to talk about mental health for sure, but we're also going to talk about things like body image. I'm excited for that episode because, you don't really typically hear from guys what body image is like. So I'm excited to have this conversation with Danny. We're also going to talk about Asian representation. I am mixed. Danny is Asian. We have very similar things that we relate to from our upbringings and other things that are different, and also stories from the workplace. So I think that will resonate with some of our listeners. And also, we're just fun. So please stick around and listen. I also want to talk about right now why we're friends and how we met, because it's kind of an unconventional story. We were actually colleagues first, and I know lots of people meet their friends at work, but I don't know that that's really typical. But you and I met because I actually interviewed you to work on our team, which I kind of love because now we've come full circle to both
Correct.
interview each other now once again. But now we don't work together anymore. We're now friends, and we've been friends for years and have just grown closer recently as we started to open up to each other and have these real, meaningful conversations. And after you sort of, poked a little bit and asked about my journey in therapy, I think you were a little bit surprised about, the fact that I went to therapy, how open I was about it, because that wasn't something you were really used to, right?
Yeah. There's definitely, I remember it very clearly. So definitely we met because I was, looking for a change of pace from my old role at the company that I was working at. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to try something different. And I remember going for the very first interview. It was you and one other individual. But I remember just kind of walking into the interview thinking like, okay, here we go. I had my guard up about what an interview is going to be like. People are going to be very stern and serious. But that interview was not. It actually was one of the first interviews I ever had where I thought, oh, we can just have a conversation about work and how that will look like in a new role. And that was actually already very different because for me, I've done interviews before and they always had this air of seriousness, which I was like expecting from you. However, it's different. For you, it was like, let's just talk about work, talk about stuff, and just have a conversation. And I was like, oh, that was very relaxing.
Danny,
to me.
Are you saying that I'm a really good interviewer?
I mean, yes. Yeah, sure. Let's go with that. I mean, I got hired, so
you got the job. Yes.
I got the job. So I think at the end of the day, that was important. But, that's how we initially met. And then, we worked together in the same role for a couple of years. But I remember that in terms of the topic of therapy coming up, I can't actually remember how the actual conversation started, but I do remember that you just kind of had an offhand comment to me where you said, oh, actually, I do therapy. And I don't think I gave it away in my expression, but I was kind of surprised because you were the first person that I knew in real life that said out loud that, you go to therapy. And therapy to me, and, this could be a thing for, depending how you grew up or how people are. But for me, the idea of therapy was not for people from my culture. It was something that I've only seen in TV and in movies. And it was always Caucasian people. And I remember watching, those scenes that they kind of stereotypically do. Usually, a patient is lying down and then you got the psychologist or psychiatrist or therapist in this case, usually a much older Caucasian dude with a beer and a pipe, and it's a dark, dim room. And I remember watching those things and go, oh, that must be nice. They got extra tools for stuff that I just didn't think was available for other people. And so growing up, I just kind of assumed that it was not for me. So when you said it, I was like, oh, maybe it's available for other people. And that was actually maybe 3-4 years ago. But it stuck with me when it came to my own time to start therapy. And I think we'll get into that. But for me, it was like, I think if you hadn't told me though, I don't know if I would have been as comfortable looking for a therapist myself, because I would go like, oh, here I am doing it alone. But when I was actually looking for one, I was like, oh, wait, no, I know Jocelyn did that. So it is something that's available to people like me.
I'm
Not just
I'm pushing my agenda all the time at work, out in public. I just talk about therapy all the time. That's actually how I met one of my very good friends here where I live right now. I was out for a walk. We were both walking our dogs, and she told me that she lets her dog sleep with her. And I said, so do I. My therapist said that it was a good idea. And she was like, you go to therapy too? And so now we're besties because of it. So let's talk about it more. I want to hear about why you started. But just before we get into that, for some of our listeners who don't know us, why don't you talk about your background so they know why you feel like you're not part of the White People Club? Because I only have a half membership to that club. I am half white. I call it Wonder Bread, but my dad's side of the family is a mix of like Scottish and English, and they've basically been in Canada for like many generations. And then on my mom's side, we're Hakka Chinese. My mom and grandma were born in India and met my grandfather, who was born in China, and they all immigrated to Canada in the 70s. So two completely different cultures coming together. What about you, Danny?
Yeah, so this is actually, as you're saying the stuff that you just said right now, I was thinking about how like, oh, it's one of the things that I wanted to, kind of bring up, but also be like, hey, this is actually interesting because you and I have very different backgrounds. You and I come from very different lifestyles. And I think that's, part of the charm of it, where it's like, oh, we kind of see things, live things a little bit differently. But in terms of like, just like, a brief story about my background, it's that, so I'm Taiwanese, and, me and my family, we immigrated here back in 1990. And, the family that we have here is basically my immediate family and a few aunts and uncles. But the majority of my entire, family tree is still back in Taiwan. And this is definitely something that we're going to get into, well, I'm sure in one of the episodes, because I don't really know that much about my family history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, it's not done. I don't believe it's done consciously, but I do believe that there is an element of we don't talk about things. And so it wasn't something that I even was really conscious of until more recently, where I was like, oh yeah, you know what? There are things that just don't get talked about in my family. And I have a feeling that I'm not the only family like that. And I have a feeling that happens quite often. But that's actually something I think we'll explore as well in our conversations here. But basically, we came in 1990, we immigrated here, and, I just kind of grown up here. I have gone home a few times, but most of my time has been here.
So how old were you when you came here again?
I was 6.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah,
so you have a little bit of a childhood not in Canada.
Yeah, I do have memories of being in Taiwan, and I think that's important that there are certain memories that I have in there that even those come up in my therapy as well. And a lot of it comes from there, a lot of it comes from here, but we'll talk about those things, especially the topics you mentioned earlier, like body image, representation, culture, identity. I think that's something that's very intriguing to people who've, moved to different places, who've immigrated, growing up in a place where you don't see a lot of yourself out there, the things that does. So, yeah, that's kind of a short, brief history of my background.
Nice. And why did you start therapy? Besides, obviously, me influencing you.
Yeah, your influence. So, okay. So let me explain my story. So, right now it's 2022. And last year, there was a time where, um, therapy actually wasn't something that I really thought too much about, even though, you had brought it up once to me and I heard about it. And it was something that I knew was available. But I remember also thinking at one point where I thought, well, I don't have no real good reason to go to therapy. Like, what am I going to do there? But I remember thinking, oh, it'd be kind of nice to go just to kind of say that I've been to a therapist, and I'm like, what would I say? What would I, do if I'm there? And I remember thinking, oh, maybe I just go and just say like, hey, I just want to know what it's like to be in this office and speak to a therapist, but I have no idea what that actually would mean.
I just want to know what it's like to lie on that fancy couch and have somebody write things down on a clipboard.
Yeah, and honestly, I did kind of want to lie down, and I did want to lie down and talk to somebody. And I'll speak on this further, but the unfortunate thing with COVID is that was not a thing that could be done. Everything was done online.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of go back a little bit in time, so there was one particular incident that started my whole entire journey. And that incident is that there was, I want to say this was May of 2021. And there's one day, it's over the weekend, I think it was a Saturday or Sunday. And, I was just, at home. My girlfriend was there. And my girlfriend was working on the computer. She was on the computer because she was, just looking for work. She had recently finished some school and she was looking to kind of move into a different area of work. And, she was working away. And I remember I was sitting and I looked at the time. It was 2:30. And I was getting kind of hungry. We usually have late lunches. But I was like, oh, it's already 2:30. It's kind of getting late. And I remember looking at my girlfriend who was working on the computer. And I was thinking about how, oh, she's working away. She's kind of busy. I don't really want to disturb her. However, I am getting kind of hungry. So I thought, okay, I don't really want to stop her workflow. She seems like she's really into it right now. So why don't I just say to her, hey, do you want to take a quick 10, 15-minute break? Let's just go grab some lunch, come back, have a quick bite, and you can continue working away. And I thought that, and I was like, oh, it's great that she's working so hard, and, I'm very proud of her. But when it came time for me to voice that, all that came out of my mouth was, so I guess lunch is going to be really late today.
Ooh, passive aggressive Danny.
Oh, so passive aggressive. And I remember as soon as my words came out, I'm like, what the hell was that? And my girlfriend turned to me and I think she was shocked. And I was like, I remember being like, I don't actually know why I said that. And I was, apologetic about it. And I kind of explained myself. And, but that was it. We ended up getting lunch and everything.
But this is, okay, so this is the sound, this might sound normal to people because we all have a touch of passive aggressiveness here and there, or we've met people who are and who aren't aware of it. Like it's just, not that big of a deal. But for you, I think the word that many of us describe Danny with is easygoing and go with the flow and doesn't get upset. So even having like that little hint of aggression, whether that was passive aggression or not, having that come out of you is just like, when you told me the story, I was like, what? You said what? So yeah. I'm not surprised that you felt shock at yourself for that coming out of your mouth.
Yeah, it definitely was something where it clearly shocked me because it was one of those times where I'm like, oh, I noticed it right away.
Mm-hmm.
And even though, that moment kind of ended, I remember for like the next week, it just stuck in my head. I was like, what was that all about? And the only thing I could kind of figure out was like, I understood that it was a passive aggressive moment. Because clearly all I wanted to say was, let's get lunch. But why did I say it the way I did? And it wasn't direct. It was a runaround. It was kind of rude. And I remember for like a week, I just kept Googling what passive aggressive meant to try and understand, like, what does it mean to be passive aggressive? And what are the symptoms? What is it like? And where does it come from? What does it mean? Why is somebody passive aggressive? And I did that for about a week. And at one point, I was kind of chatting with my sister about it. And I told her the exact same thing. And I said, I've been Googling a lot of information. And she kind of made a suggestion and says, well, Danny, as much as you can Google, all of this is going to be fairly generic and vague. You may want to get some help that's very specific to you. Otherwise, there's only so much you can kind of understand. And I thought, okay, that's cool. Great point. And that's when the idea of finding a therapist came about. And that's when I initially was like, am I actually going to find a therapist? Like, is this what's happening to me? Almost in like not exactly a positive thinking. It's just like, oh, what's happening to me? But then I remember, like, Jocelyn, you do therapy. But this was before you and I even had these kind of conversations at all. I don't think you knew that. And I spent about 2 weeks and I just said, you know what? Let me just Google psychologist, therapist. Shout out to Psychology Today website. And I did my research where I read through the profiles of I believe I went through at least 60 profiles of different therapists. And I just read like their profiles. I read what they do. And I narrowed it down to 10 therapists. And then I ended up kind of contacting all of them. And that came down to 4 consultation calls.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got a call with every single one of them. And it was the 4th individual therapist in which I had a conversation and basically asked me, like, why are you calling? What are you looking for? What do you need help on? And I explained the incident of me being passive aggressive. And I said, can you help me with that? I want to find out why I did that. And that was how I found my therapist. And that was the reason why I found a therapist in the first place. Yeah. So that was kind of the main thing.
I think that is really helpful for people to know, like the process that you just explained. I get a lot of questions from people asking like, oh, how did you find your therapist? How do you do that? And the process that you just outlined is absolutely what I recommend. I think it's good to go online and do your research, narrow it down. Don't feel like you need to go to just one. It might take a few before you find somebody that you really click with. I think you're lucky because you're still with that same therapist. Like you really hit it off with them. I have gone through, I think, 5. Not that they were all bad. Actually, 2 of them were really great. The rest I just didn't click with. But I went to one for a very specific issue. And then once that was like sort of resolved, I found the next one for more like overall general therapy. So that's another thing. You don't need to stick with the same therapist. Of course, it's helpful because they can see how you grow. But yeah, therapy is going to be different for everybody.
Yeah, and I do think that's an interesting point that you made too, because I have read articles of people saying like, oh, if you feel like you want to switch and all that stuff, it's fine. Even my own therapist actually asked me, she's like, do you want to continue? And I said, yeah, why not? But she said, I did say to her, like, yeah, I think one of the things that I enjoy is that this person has a bit of a history of how I started.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for me, it was also, I think we get along fine. So I think that makes a big difference. But if we didn't and I was looking for a different therapist, and I imagined that I kind of would have to explain everything from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But also the new therapist would not have that knowledge to see the changes that I've kind of gone through and the growth since last year.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess, I don't know, maybe you want to explain a little bit about how you go from your start to 5 therapists?
Yeah. So, okay, let's see. I don't think I'm going to go through them like as a play-by-play, as if this is like, a story where I detail all of my terrible exes, because it's really not like that. But
Okay, yeah.
I will say that, for instance, when I went for like 2 months, I'd say, and she made everything, basically she blamed every problem that I brought up on the patriarchy, which, listen, that's my shit. Oh, no. Don't make that like dissatisfied noise, because normally is my jam. And honestly, it's the truth. We can blame everything on the patriarchy. But sometimes, I just needed some either like validation or some helpful tools to get through what I was going through. And as much as I want to smash the patriarchy, I didn't want to pay $150 every week to like talk about how much I hate the patriarchy. Because like I do that for free, man. Like, yes,
right.
I get it.
Yeah.
Love her, love it, but that just wasn't working for me. Another therapist I went to, this is actually a good lesson in like, therapists have their own biases too, right? So once she found out that Azim, my husband, is Muslim, she had some like prejudices, I would say. So I would bring up like really arbitrary relationship challenges that I think anyone would go through, but she would find a way to like bring up his background, and I'd be like, that's not it. Yeah. So couldn't go to her anymore. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of them. Like I literally just said I wasn't going to do that, and now I'm doing it. But the 2 that I went through that I found really helpful, one of them was when it was for what I really needed from therapy, which was to help me through something I was going through at work that was ultimately causing me a lot of anxiety. This anxiety was bleeding into the rest of my life because I had a leader at work who was gaslighting me. And I didn't know what gaslighting even meant at that point. This was years ago. And this therapist really helped me understand that was what I was going through, and ultimately how I could process it and let it go. So after that situation, that came to a close and I was a lot better off, I was able to part ways with her, but she was like invaluable. It was really, really helpful for me at that time in my life. And then I started therapy again because I was noticing that I felt like a different person in my late 20s than I was in my early 20s. And I know that sounds silly. Like, we all grow up, we all mature, we get more responsibilities. But there was a point where I felt like I didn't recognize myself. Like, I'd say, 21-year-old Joss would have no issues doing XYZ, whether that was like picking up and traveling, or, doing a presentation in front of a bunch of people, or even like mundane things like driving to the airport to pick up Azim in bad weather. Now, many of these types of things I can't do without I'm better now, but in the past few years, I'd get so stressed. It was like debilitating. And I don't think that I really show that on the outside. Like, I definitely think that I come off as much more confident and capable, but sometimes, I'd get almost like, I call them anxiety episodes. I don't want to call them panic attacks because it's not that extreme, but they can get quite bad where I have to like run to the bathroom and hide from the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and also it's those feelings have like sometimes prevented me from doing things that I felt like my younger, more confident self would do. So this therapist used cognitive behavioral therapy with me, which I found really, really helpful. Like, it's much more hands-on than talk therapy. And that was like, that made a night and day difference in helping me overcome those feelings. So I'm actually not currently in therapy. I think I'm in a really good place mental health wise, but I still advocate for it so much for people who just, like you, Danny, like, you want to understand why you do the things you do. I think just having a better understanding helps you be the best version of yourself. And it's not just about like being happy, sometimes it's just about like how to get through life in the best way possible. And therapy is super helpful.
Yeah, I think you touched upon a couple of things actually while you're explaining, your side of things. I guess one thing too, I didn't think about bringing up, but that makes a good point, is therapy. I remember when I started therapy thinking like, I assumed it's very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure most people would probably look at the pricing and go, that is kind of expensive. And I think that's, I guess that's something where not everybody can necessarily afford that. I think that's something where I do feel like, I'm very lucky to be able to have that cost and be okay with it. Like my therapist is $150
Mm-hmm.
Per session, and that session is 50 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
And mine is specifically talk therapy. You mentioned like CBT and things like that, but mine's been specifically only talk therapy, and it's interesting. And I don't know if you had this experience, but when my very first session, it actually, I kind of walked away from it being like, is this all there is to it? It's actually, it didn't feel that great to me.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, my therapist asking like, oh, so, because I didn't know how to start. I didn't know how to start it. So she was like, oh, so, maybe just tell me about your parents. And I was like,
Tell me about your parents. Literally,
okay.
That's what every therapist starts with. Yeah.
And I'm like, but I'm here for passive aggressive. Why am I talking about my parents? I don't understand.
Little did you know. Yeah.
I don't understand. And of course, as time goes on, it really did kind of make sense to me. But I don't know for you in your, I understand that you're not doing that right now, but if you think about the ones that you did do, like for me, I'm still going just because even though my initial reason for going in technically has been, I want to say, quote unquote, resolved, I realized that there's just a lot more to go into. However, I imagine not everybody, like the fact that you stopped or, you switched, I just kind of figured it makes sense to keep going, but I guess your thought process is a bit different.
Okay. It's more like, so you mentioned you went to your first session and you were like, is this all there is to it? And it's almost like, is this worth it? But then as you went on and sort of did a deeper dive, it became apparent that, you're getting a lot out of these sessions, you're learning more about yourself, and you continue to do so. For me, I stopped after like the last 3 sessions with that therapist were kind of like, repetitive, and also I noticed the feeling I was getting before the session was, oh man, I have to go to therapy. So that's when I was like, okay, I don't need to do 50 minutes of this. And at that point I had started weekly, then we went down to biweekly. And even when those biweekly notices came up in my calendar, I was like, I don't want to do this week. So I wasn't getting what I had been getting out of it. And also I just did a check-in with myself, and it had been a really long time since I had my last anxiety episode. So things felt good, and they continue to feel good. And I have some things outside of therapy I do that help my mental health. We can talk about those things in another episode, but yeah, the wheels are turning. So I'm good for now.
Yeah, the wheels are definitely turning. I think that's kind of how we got here.
That's right.
If the wheels weren't turning, we would not be here right now. So I think that's a good way of explaining that one.
Okay, yeah, no, I want to say, Danny, I'm so proud of you for pitching this podcast episode. A year ago, when we were still working together, I remember we'd have conversations. I'd be like, oh, so what'd you do last night? And you'd be like, honestly, Joss, I just went home and went on Reddit and I fell asleep. And you just were like so in that status quo of like the grind, right? Like the work grind, and also you weren't pursuing any hobbies, but you opened up this little seed of like a dream to me where you were like, you know what would be really cool if I could like create something. And you specifically referenced Hot Ones, which we both love. Chicken Wing Talk Show. And I was like, you know what, Danny, I'm just going to keep poking you until then you're not going to answer me with, I just sat on Reddit. You're going to have your own Chicken Wing Talk Show. And now you do have your own talk show, Sans Chicken Wings, and I get to be a part of it. And I'm so excited. I'm so proud of you for doing this.
We can add chicken wings as well at some point. That's not off the table. That's not off the table.
No, it is. I'm not eating and talking to a microphone. I don't know if you've noticed, Danny and I are on video just so that we can talk to each other. And I keep leaning out of the frame because I'm swallowing and I don't want people to hear my spit or like the swallowing noise. I am anti-mouth noises. I'm not about that ASMR life.
ASMR.
No, thank you. Not for me. So if we add chicken wings, it will be when we stop recording.
Okay. Well, your mind might change at some point. Who knows? Maybe we'll add video one day. And then we can have chicken wings.
I'm very proud of you, though.
Thank you.
One more thing I want to talk about. You mentioned that you started therapy. It was helpful. Let's just dive a little bit into, did you find out why you were being passive aggressive?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now because this is actually a while back. But there was, now I guess I'll bring it up, and I guess maybe we can go into it a little bit further at some point. But if my memory serves me correctly, I want to say that passive aggressiveness, of course, there are explanations and I guess general reasonings behind it. However, I think in my conversations about myself specifically and just, very personally, it had to do a lot with the, not necessarily inability, but the desire to not have any kind of confrontation. Because I think the idea is like, to be passive aggressive is the fact that you're not really saying anything directly. You're saying things to kind of get around it. And that's something where I think it's like a bit of like, there's some bits of people pleasing in there in a sense like, you don't really want to upset anyone, but you still kind of am trying to get a point across. So it's like you, or in this case, me, it's like this internal thought process of like, okay, I'm kind of either annoyed or frustrated about something. So I want to voice that. However, at the same time, I don't really want to be confrontational and upset the other person. So what happens? You get kind of passive, but you're still a bit aggressive about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was something where I learned for myself. Was like, oh, this idea that like I learned, and again, we'll go over this I think at some point, that you want to be nice to others, and it's kind of like you want to be pleasing, and you want to be good in other people's eyes. So you want to kind of have that positive look to others. And so you're people pleasing, and you just don't want to upset other people. I think that's one of the big takeaways for me. And so then that became a thing of like, okay, well, once you identify that though, it's like, okay, well, now you got to look into why that even happens in the first place. Why is that even a thing for myself, and where does that come from? And there are many points, I think, when I looked into it in my therapy sessions, but it's like that a lot of this stuff comes from the way I was raised, whether it's the environment, whether it's the things that was taught to me, or sometimes even the things that were not necessarily consciously taught to me, but they were just things that I kind of internalized myself. Along the way, there was some message that was internalized as a young Danny that said like, hey, if you want to get by in life, you got to make sure that, people like you. You don't want to upset anyone. Don't confront people. Just kind of be under the radar, put your head down, do your work, and it'll be okay. And I think as a little kid, that probably worked. But then as an adult, these things come back and you're like, it doesn't seem to work. And that's when I sometimes will have like this idea like, oh, something's wrong, but I don't know what it is. And honestly, like, even with, when you mentioned, number one, thank you for being proud of me. But two, I do remember that time period where you would ask me, like, oh, how was your evening? And I'm like, yeah, honestly, I did just go home. And then for like hours on end, it was something on the internet, Reddit, Netflix, YouTube. And I did that for years, many, many years. But I also didn't know why. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I knew that it was really difficult to not do that. So if I go home and I don't do those things, it feels very uncomfortable.
Yeah. We called it numbing.
Yes, numbing.
Yeah.
And numbing is something where I just kind of assumed that was just me. So that's another example where I'm like, oh, I think that's just me. I don't think no one else is having these problems or perceived problems. And I think that's where therapy is stuff that I kind of started looking into. So that's something for maybe another episode, I think, because I think we're going to dive more deeply into other specific topics. I know you're excited about body image. I have thoughts on that, that's for sure. And then I know at some point we got a couple of topics lined up where we're thinking about going through anxiety is one of them.
Yep.
And I know we have, I believe, what are the other ones again?
CEN.
So CEN, and that's going to be very specific to me because that's something I learned very recently about myself. So CEN is childhood emotional neglect. And that actually is going to be very specific and definitely resonates with my life. And because that's something where I think I obviously didn't know that was a thing. And once I kind of learned about it, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense now. Mm-hmm. But I do not believe that's very mainstream in any way. So I don't think many people know that.
Yeah, but I think just hearing your story and like hearing about those aha moments, it's impactful. So thank you for sharing. I think that's a good place to wrap. We did a good cover. We know what's coming up next. I hope our listeners are excited. I think we should also, before we end, give a shout out to Hanger and your sister for being the real catalysts for your therapy journey. And
That's true. Yeah.
yeah, for me, in addition to, just taking a look at my life and knowing I need to go, I also have to give a shout out to our friend Nora, because she is the one who was really open to me about her therapy journey. And she was going through that gaslighting with me and was a huge help during that time in my life. So shout out to Nora, who's one of my favorite people. So
I think we'll have, maybe one day we'll have some people on. These people might be on at some point. Do you want to plug anything?
Oh, yeah. That's so embarrassing. I have a blog and a newsletter. I am not on socials. I'm not part of that social media life. But I do write a weekly newsletter that people like, and by people I mean my mom and Danny. So you can go to my blog to subscribe. It's jocelyncaithness.com. I'll put a link in our show notes. And that's it. How about you, Danny?
I actually do not. and maybe we'll talk about this one because I used to. I was big into Facebook. I was big into Instagram. I even tried Twitter at one point.
Oh my God, we're dating ourselves. These Gen Zs are going to be like, Facebook.
Yeah, that's okay. Back in that time, I didn't care about this kind of stuff anyway, so I don't
Back
think
in ancient times, yeah.
So for now, I'm going to say no. I don't have anything to plug, but I don't know. Maybe we'll have something come up sometime down the road.
Yeah, please subscribe. Please subscribe to this pod, and we look forward to having you for future episodes.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think that wraps it up. We will, hopefully people will tune in for next time, and we'll talk to people next episode.
Okay, bye.
Bye.